Welcome to the Business Restructuring Podcast with Parkins and Rubio.
Welcome to the Business Restructuring Podcast with Parkins and Rubio. Lenard Parkins and Charles Rubio are corporate bankruptcy and financial restructuring attorneys with offices in Houston and New York. They represent companies, lenders, and stakeholders in complex restructurings where financial pressure, litigation exposure, and strategic decision-making intersect. I'm Lisa Mosby, discussing how merchant cash advances may influence the need for bankruptcy. Welcome, Charles. Welcome, Leonard. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
And I am going to call you Lenny because I know that's how everybody talks to you, Lenny. But we'll start this first question with Charles. Charles, what is a merchant cash advance, and why do so many business owners turn to them when cash flow becomes tight?
A merchant cash advance facility is a type of financing facility. It's like a loan. It's a way for companies to access cash. And what's a beneficial aspect of it for business owners is that they can get funding more quickly than traditional loans. The diligence that the MCA lenders conduct is much briefer than a full-fledged lender does. So they can tap into the lending much more quickly. And the nature of the lending is also different in that, oftentimes there's asset-based lenders, but this type of lender is not looking at the assets, it's looking at the cash flows. It's looking to see, do you have a history of performance, and are you expected to continue to have that cash flow performance going forward? And that's how they structure these MCAs, is a percentage of the future cash flows is dedicated to pay off that loan. So those are the benefits. That's what a merchant cash advance facility is. And that's why they're attractive to business owners, is because they're very quick to get. And again, the nature of it isn't, it's not a asset-based loan, but really focused on the cash flows.
Yeah, these lenders will actually want to see the bank accounts of the borrowers in order to see the volume of cash that actually gets deposited in the account, in order to assess how much of whether, number one, they'll make the loan, and number two, how much of a loan they can make, and the expected ability to repay the loan from the cash that actually has historically come into the bank account of the potential borrower.
So, Lenny, how is merchant cash advance different from traditional factoring?
Well, merchant cash advances typically try to call themselves a purchaser of future receivables. So these receivables don't exist today. If you and I are negotiating a merchant cash advance and you're the borrower, I'm basically advancing money on future receivables that don't yet exist. A factor will buy a present receivable at a certain percentage. For example, if you have $1,000 receivable, a factor may say, after looking at who the receivable is from, I will lend you or buy it for 75% or $7,500 of the $1,000 receivable, and I will own the receivable. A merchant cash advance will advance money on future receivables, claim they own the receivables, and get paid from the money collected in the bank account at a certain percentage negotiated with a borrower. That's the difference. A factor buys receivables that exist. A merchant cash advance lender, quotes, will buy future receivables, not present receivables.
Another key difference
Sure.
in that this touches on something that Lenny was talking about before, is the interrelationship between an MCA and the bank account, is that how a merchant cash advance facility is always set up is that it directly takes ACH transactions from the entity's, for lack of a better word, borrower's bank account. It takes those either on a daily or weekly basis. It directly draws from the bank account through an ACH transaction. So that's Lenny also was describing a traditional factor which buys a created accounts receivable at a discount. Here, the structures are really fundamentally different in that they buy future accounts receivable, but how they pay themselves back is through taking direct transfers out of the borrower's bank account on a daily or weekly basis.
What's also interesting is if you look at the documents that do these MCAs, okay, they will say, I am not a lender, I'm a buyer. I'm a buyer of future accounts receivable. This is not a loan. This is a purchase of future accounts receivable. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in the context of bankruptcy strategy.
What is MCA stacking, and why is it often a sign that a business is heading toward financial distress?
So the nature of the MCA itself is intended to be a short-term liquidity boost. You get it one time often to navigate some hiccup that you have in a road, or maybe you got a big project that you need to fund it and you need quick financing in order to fund a big project that came in. But stacking is essentially where you use a new MCA, a new merchant cash advance facility to pay off an old merchant cash advance facility. And so why that's an indicator that the entity may be approaching financial distress is that it really shouldn't be used that way. It really shouldn't be used where you're constantly rotating these merchant cash advance facilities, because at the end of the day, these are very high interest financing instruments, much higher than traditional financing. So if you find yourself stacking, which is replacing a new MCA to pay off an old MCA, um, you're kind of in this loop of essentially needing these payday loans all the time. That's the troubling part of stacking MCAs.
And what it indicates is that it isn't just a single short-term cash need. You have a repeated problem with cash flow, and therefore you're seeking another lender now to take out the first lender's cash flow, incurring a very high interest rate loans in order to do that. And it indicates there's maybe a more fundamental problem with a business than a short-term cash need because of a short-term hiccup in the business.
Another thing about stacking that's worth raising now is that, stacking is also a controversial thing in the law, in that these MCAs don't want to be loans, because if they were loans, they would often exceed the amount of the usury interest rate. So what a stacking is essentially a refinancing. There's a remaining amount of the old MCA that is being paid off from the proceeds of a new MCA, so that it is a refinancing. And if there is a dispute between, the borrower and the MCA, then the existence that there was stacking is a factor that would be indicative of this being more of a loan than a real purchase of future receivables. So if an entity wanted to attack this as a usurious loan, that is a fact that would lean towards that end result of it actually being a loan and not a purchase of future receivables.
Sure. And then how can business owners recognize the warning signs that MCA debt is beginning to threaten the company's long-term viability?
Well, the most easy signal is they look at their bank account every day and they see how much money is being drawn out by the MCA lender from their bank account, and they realize that they are running short of cash and they cannot subsidize with their own operations the payback at the huge interest rates these lenders have from the cash flow that's coming in, or they may have a slowdown in cash flow and may need to negotiate the percentage. So these are signs that the owner of the company sees, that basically the drawdown of cash, which is automatic from the bank account under the MCA loans, okay, is impairing their business, and they just don't have the liquidity anymore to run their business.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Lenny. The key sign that an MCA is
So,
getting problematic is that usually you do have stacking. You have entities that have multiple MCAs sometimes, and they look at their bank account and they say, "Oh my goodness, all my money is getting drafted out of this account every day or every week from these MCAs."
and then why do businesses with MCA obligations often find themselves dealing with multiple creditors at the same time?
It's the same reality. It's this, you find yourself in a liquidity crunch. You turn to the MCAs in order to ideally solve a short-term liquidity crunch. But, these MCAs often become liquidity traps, where while they were there to solve a short-term liquidity problem, just by the nature of how they're structured and they're so short-term in their repayment, they often create liquidity constraints. And then oftentimes these owners are confronting a situation where they have to decide, which creditors they're paying because the money's being taken out of their accounts.
The MCA lenders are not generally the only creditors of a company. A company will have a lot of other creditors that need to be paid either on 30 or 60-day intervals normally. And with the MCA loan and the drawdowns of cash are so extreme, especially if you have stacked and may have two of them drawing down cash from the bank account, it just says to the company, wow, I'm running out of cash and I'm only going to pay this creditor this month and that creditor next month. And because I just don't have the cash now, and you have to decide who to pay rather than be able to pay your creditors in normal course. And that creates an accelerated pressure on the company.
And Lenny, isn't it true that you have to pay the MCAs? They're automatically taking that money out. So it's the other creditors that suffer in these cases, correct?
The MCAs automatically take their money. The way the MCA is structured is they give access, the borrower gives access to the bank account that the MCA lender has studied to say how much money comes in. And they give access to that bank account to take out the contractual amount of money every week or every month from the bank account automatically versus writing a check to creditors to pay their debt. The MCAs take their money first. When I wake up, I'll see how much they took versus I'm going to pay the bill. That's a big difference.
How can bankruptcy immediately change the situation for a business struggling with MCA obligations?
Yeah, one of the immediate advantages of bankruptcy is the automatic stay. So that's an injunction on creditors from taking actions against a debtor in bankruptcy. So what that practically means is that ACH that was occurring every week or every day, which they're often structured every day, they actually take out money out of the account, that immediately stops upon the filing. Another huge advantage from a bankruptcy perspective is that the future work that entity does, the future work that creates post-petition accounts receivable, those post-petition accounts receivable are not subject to the liens of the MCA lenders, pre-petition liens, or at least they shouldn't. So that's another advantage there, is that you immediately have a partition in time where a debtor in possession in bankruptcy can start doing work, start generating post-petition accounts receivable that are outside of the liens of the MCA lender. So those are two immediate advantages that you get as an entity filing for Chapter 11 when you have MCA debt.
It is important to understand, just to clarify something Charles said. There's pre-bankruptcy, and then you draw a big line when you file Chapter 11, for example, bankruptcy. That demarcation is very significant. By statute, for example, as Charles said, newly created receivables would not be subject to a pre-bankruptcy lien or security interest, nor would newly created receivables be subject necessarily to their claim that they're purchasing those receivables. That demarcation of filing bankruptcy is critical in order to cut off rights that a MCA lender might assert pre-bankruptcy. They're slowed down or impossible to assert on newly created receivables post-bankruptcy. And that's why the consequence of filing bankruptcy has to be considered when dealing with an MCA loan. If things get so tight, your cash flow is just not enough to run the business.
So, Charles, how can Chapter 11 transform MCA obligations into a more manageable repayment structure?
Yeah, this is really the core of Chapter 11, is to manage those pre-petition debts. And one of the fundamental ways of doing that is to stretch out your debt payments. So where you may owe an MCA lender $100,000 and on their normal payment schedule that was under your contract with them, maybe you had to pay that back in 3 months. Maybe you had to pay that back in 12 weekly installments over 3 months. In a Chapter 11 plan, you could pay that amount over monthly installments over 4 years. It's possible to stretch that out. And not only that, unlike the APR that you had pre-petition, which the APR on these facilities could easily be 100% or more. Sometimes we've seen 200, 250% APR on merchant cash advance facilities. Is that on a post-petition basis, not only are you stretching it out and possibly paying it over multiple years, you're also paying it at an interest rate that's a normal interest rate. You're talking about a prime plus 1 to 3% if it's considered a secured debt. So you're making it a much more manageable financial obligation to be dealt with and paid over time under a Chapter 11 plan.
The other thing that happens in Chapter 11, it gives you a forum to challenge the integrity of the loan itself, whether it be usurious or whether it is in fact just a purchase agreement, or in most cases where the litigation is going around the country with respect to these, is they're reading through the documents and calling them usurious loans. And usurious loans carry with them punishments. For example, you may lose the ability to collect the loan. You may have be subject to personal liability. In some states, you may be subject to criminal liability for the amount of interest charged when it's determined to be a loan and not a purchase. That's why their purchase agreements, their agreements say this is a purchase agreement. This is not a loan. They do everything they can to say this is not a loan. But courts, when challenged, are looking closely at these, and the scrutiny is coming out more and more that these are loans and they're usurious loans, and they're subjecting the MCA lenders to serious consequences because of that. And it gives you the forum to challenge that very vigorously.
And another means of challenging it, which is separate and apart from being a usurious loan and trying to recognize it as a loan, is that there's an action that's very common in bankruptcy called a fraudulent transfer action, and the specific one called a constructive fraudulent transfer action, which is a transfer for less than a reasonably equivalent value. So, for instance, if a company was to give a car away to a relative of an owner, that might be clawed back as a transfer for no value to the entity. In a similar way, if these facilities have been challenged on the basis that they are not reasonably equivalent value, that they're giving too much value away, and there's a possibility of clawing some of that amount back into the bankruptcy estate as well. So there's many ways of attacking these facilities after you're in a bankruptcy case, either by trying to characterize it as a loan that's a usurious loan, or alternatively, clawing back some of the funds as being less than reasonably equivalent value.
Charles, here's where I want to wrap this up today. What should business owners be evaluating if MCA obligations are creating significant financial pressure for them?
Well, certainly as a bankruptcy lawyer, I would say you need to be evaluating, your bankruptcy options. And, Chapter 11, you don't have to be insolvent to use Chapter 11. That's incredibly important. You just have to have a financial issue that Chapter 11 can solve. So, that course of action needs to be considered for business owners who are in this situation and can look out a month or two on the horizon and see, maybe I don't have a liquidity problem right now, but this is snowballing into a liquidity problem. So that's one thing that business owners should be concerned about. And just as a more general matter, we've seen merchant cash advance facilities go from really industries where it's really mom and pop businesses, smaller businesses that are getting facilities for 100, 200, 300,000 short-term facilities. And we've seen these really penetrate the middle market now, where we've started to see $1 million, $2 million MCAs that are going to more substantial businesses. So, it's not just the mom and pops that are looking at this. It's even the smaller businesses that may have just taken on too much of this, and their expectation of why they needed that short-term liquidity actually was a longer duration, and they need a longer-term solution. And Chapter 11 is something that they should be evaluating.
Right. Companies who need, for example, $1 million and can find an MCA lender who'll do it. If you're borrowing $1 million at in excess of probably 30% interest, and it's coming right out of your bank account, and you realize all of a sudden that if your business is not generating the kind of revenue you expected, you are burdened by a tremendous draw on cash flow. And therefore, you have to decide how you stop that draw on cash flow and run your business successfully. And Chapter 11 offers that alternative to basically run your business successfully and pay off the debt over time and challenge the integrity of the debt. Maybe you'll get a deal where the debt goes down by virtue of the challenge against the integrity of the debt, You'll have less debt to pay in the aggregate over time in a Chapter 11 plan. But the goal is to go in, do a Chapter 11 plan, a payout program for the creditor, and the right and venue and form to challenge the debt in order to reconcile it to a right amount.
Lenny, Charles, thank you so much for your insights on walking us through this process and how it can support business owners in moving forward. That's it for today's episode of the Business Restructuring Podcast with Parkins and Rubio. If you'd like to learn more about Lenard Parkins and Charles Rubio, you can visit their website at parkinsrubio.com. Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.